How did one of the richest nations on earth end up with breadlines, dust storms, and 25% unemployment? This is the story of how the American dream nearly collapsed, and what it took to rebuild it. The Roaring Twenties, that's what they called it, and for good reason. America was booming, the war was over, soldiers were coming home, factories were running at full speed. Jazz was everywhere, radios were selling fast, credit was flowing, and people believed, truly believed, that the good times would never end. After World War I, the US economy exploded into a post-war boom. Millions of Americans joined the workforce, including women who had stepped in during the war, and suddenly the American dream looked more alive than ever. In Detroit, a man named Henry Ford was changing everything. His invention, the Model T, wasn't just a car, it was a symbol, a promise, a product that anyone could afford. Thanks to Ford's assembly line, the price dropped from $780 to just $290. By 1927, 15 million Model Ts had rolled off the line. Other companies copied the idea. Washing machines, vacuum cleaners. Radio's mass production had arrived, and so had mass consumption. But people didn't just want these new products. They had to have them. Banks made it easy. Loans, credit, installments. You didn't need the money now. You could buy it today, worry about paying for it later. The economy was on fire, and behind the flames was a fuel called confidence. Wall Street took notice. Between 1921 and 1929, the US stock market grew sixfold. People who had never touched a stock before were suddenly investing everything they had, and more. Some borrowed money just to buy in. Why? Because stocks only went up, or so they thought. Everyone was talking about it. Stocks. Your neighbor was investing. Your barber had tips. Even taxi drivers bragged about their portfolios. It was the new gold rush, and everyone wanted in. People weren't just investing their savings, they were borrowing money to buy stocks. It was called buying on margin. You only needed 10% of the price to buy a share. The rest, you borrowed. If the stock went up, you paid off the loan and pocketed the difference. Easy money. By 1929, 40% of all consumer debt in the US was tied to the stock market, and people believed it was just the beginning. Every year brought record highs. Every dip was seen as a buying opportunity. The belief was simple: stocks always go up. But underneath the excitement, cracks were forming. The economy wasn't growing as fast as the market. Europe was still recovering from World War I. Global trade was slowing. Demand for consumer goods was falling. But the stock market didn't care. It kept climbing, fueled by hype, hope, and leverage. Stock prices were no longer based on real company profits. They were based on the assumption that someone else would buy it for more. It wasn't investing anymore. It was gambling. But the music kept playing, and no one wanted to be the first to leave the dance floor. Then, it all collapsed. October 24th, 1929, a day that would go down in history. Black Thursday, the stock market opened in panic. Prices started falling. Investors rushed to sell. By the end of the day, a record 12.9 million shares had been traded. The market dropped 11%, and fear spread like wildfire. But that was just the beginning. 5 days later, it got worse. October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday. Over 16 million shares were sold. The market crashed another 12%. 2 weeks, that's all it took for the market to lose 1/3 of its value. People were devastated. Those who had borrowed to invest were wiped out. Margin calls came in. Loans were due, and the banks wanted their money, but it was gone. Life savings evaporated, retirements destroyed, fortunes lost overnight. And yet, as brutal as it was, the stock market crash wasn't the main cause of the Great Depression. It was the spark, but the fire was already burning underneath. What made it worse was what came next. After the crash, panic spread beyond Wall Street. People rushed to their banks to withdraw whatever money they had left, but there was a problem. Back then, there was no deposit insurance. If your bank failed, your money was gone. And many banks were already in trouble. In the 1920s, thousands of small, independent banks across America had taken risky bets. They gave out easy loans, not just to consumers, but to investors buying stocks on margin. When the market tanked, those loans couldn't be repaid, and the banks started collapsing. One by one. Headlines reported failures. People panicked. Even healthy banks were hit by bank runs, mobs of customers demanding their money all at once. In New York City, a false rumor spread that the Bank of the United States had refused to sell someone's stock. That was enough. 1,000 people lined up outside. By the end of the day, 3 million had been withdrawn. The bank collapsed shortly after. It was one of the largest bank failures in American history, and it sent shockwaves through the entire system. Within a few years, over 9,000 banks would fail, and more than $550 million in deposits would disappear. Forever. People stopped trusting banks. They kept their money in cash, under mattresses, or hidden at home. As a result, the money supply shrank. Between 1929 and 1933, the amount of currency in circulation fell by 31%. This wasn't just a financial crisis anymore. It was a complete breakdown of trust. As banks collapsed and money disappeared, another danger took hold: deflation. Prices fell, wages dropped, but debts? They stayed the same. In fact, they got harder to pay. With less money in circulation, every dollar became more valuable, but also harder to earn. People stopped spending. Businesses stopped hiring. Investments froze. And the Federal Reserve, instead of stepping in, stood back. They allowed the money supply to shrink. They didn't act to stabilize the banking system. They didn't cut interest rates fast enough. Historians and economists agree this was one of the greatest policy failures in U.S. history. The economy spiraled. Wages fell. Companies shut down. Unemployment soared. By 1933, nearly 25% of Americans were out of work. Entire industries collapsed. Mills, factories, farms, all silent. And in the middle of it all, President Herbert Hoover insisted things would get better. He believed the market would self-correct. He feared government intervention would do more harm than good, so he waited. But the people couldn't wait. They lost jobs. They lost homes. They lost hope. And across the country, shanty towns started popping up. Makeshift shelters for the homeless. They were called Hoovervilles, named after the man many blamed for doing too little, too late. The pain wasn't just American. The Great Depression went global. In 1930, President Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, hoping to protect U.S. farmers and industries by raising taxes on foreign imports. But it backfired. Other countries retaliated. Trade wars erupted. Over 25 nations imposed their own tariffs on American goods. Global trade collapsed. Between 1929 and 1934, world trade fell by more than 66%. What started as a financial crisis became a global economic breakdown. But the devastation didn't stop there. In the middle of America, another disaster hit. This one wasn't economic. It was environmental. Years of aggressive farming had stripped the land of nutrients. When drought came, the soil turned to dust. Strong winds swept across the Great Plains, creating massive black storms. This became known as the Dust Bowl. For farmers, it was the final blow. Crops died. Livestock starved. Tens of thousands lost their farms. Entire families packed up and left, heading west, hoping to survive. By the mid-1930s, more than 34 million Americans had no income. Breadlines stretched across cities, soup kitchens overflowed, and Desperation took root. The United States, once the symbol of prosperity, was now a nation of scarcity. And people began asking the same question: how do we get out of this? In 1932, Americans voted for change, and they got it, but with Franklin D. Roosevelt. He promised bold action. He promised hope. He promised a New Deal. Unlike his predecessor, Roosevelt believed the government had to act, and act fast. He launched a sweeping set of programs aimed at relief, recovery, and reform. He created Social Security, unemployment insurance, and minimum wage laws. He limited working hours and protected labor rights. He provided jobs through public works projects, bridges, roads, schools. But Roosevelt didn't stop there. He targeted the root causes of the crisis. To rebuild trust in the banking system, he established the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Now, if a bank failed, people wouldn't lose their saving. He also created the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, to regulate the stock market, bringing transparency and accountability to Wall Street. These reforms helped stabilize the economy. They didn't fix everything overnight, but they stopped the bleeding. Slowly, confidence returned. Slowly, money flowed again. Slowly, America began to stand back up. But full recovery, that would require something much bigger. It wasn't the New Deal that finally ended the Great Depression. It was World War II. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, the United States didn't join immediately, but it began to prepare. Factories reopened, production skyrocketed, the military demanded planes, tanks, uniforms, food, everything. Suddenly the government was spending on a scale never seen before, and with it came jobs. By 1941, unemployment had dropped below 10%. Millions of Americans went to work, not just in the military, but in factories across the country. The war effort pulled the US out of its decade-long economic nightmare, not by fixing the system, but by overwhelming it with demand. It was a brutal way out, but it worked. And when the war ended, the US emerged, not just recovered, but stronger than ever before. The Great Depression didn't begin with war. It began with overconfidence, with unchecked risk, with debt, speculation, and the belief that nothing could go wrong. It was made worse by slow action, bad policy, and fear. But from it, we learned the importance of regulation, of monetary policy, of consumer protection. We learned that markets need rules, that trust takes decades to build and seconds to lose. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all: no boom lasts forever, and no crash is without cause. And just like every bubble, an inflated market always ends the same way, with a painful crash. If you found this story insightful, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more content like this. Thanks for watching.